A colossal stone pyramid has stood unbroken for 4,000 years. It's a mystery of ancient engineering. How did they do it without steel or silicon? How did they design structures to survive in extreme environments, earthquake zones, frozen peaks? There are timeless principles at work here, principles that let these monuments outlast empires. They tamed seismic forces with flexible walls. They turned scorching heat into natural air conditioning. And their forgotten genius, it reveals something about our own relationship with the natural world. They started by watching, not in a workshop, but just by looking. For a long time, ancient engineers, they would spend lifetimes watching. They tracked the sun's arc across the sky. Not just for a season, but for generations. They learned to read the wind by how it shaped the land, which sides of a hill were stripped bare, where the sand piled into dunes. They watched rivers in flood and in drought. They saw water not as something to wall away, but as a force. Its energy could be guided. Even animals gave clues. Where the ground was stable, where water might be found, this wasn't a quick survey. It was a deep, accumulated wisdom, a living library passed from elder to apprentice. The blueprint wasn't on papyrus, it was written in the patterns of the world, so their structures were conceived in harmony with the forces they needed to survive. They weren't imposing a design on the landscape, they were listening to it, asking it how to build. That first choice was the ground itself. It was a sacred act. A location was never just a convenient piece of land. It was a living partner, chosen through a mix of spiritual vision and hard practicality. A high plateau over a valley, for example. Practically, it's a fortress against floods, against invaders, but the height also brought them closer to the heavens. That view connected them to their gods. The site served two masters, the physical and the divine. This duality is everywhere. A city founded where a fresh spring emerged from rock. Water meant survival. Life for thousands, but that spring was also a gift, a sacred place. By weaving the practical source into their beliefs, they guaranteed its preservation. You wouldn't pollute a gift from the gods. The resilience of their water was baked into their values. Then the alignments, a temple doorway positioned so the summer solstice sun pours light onto the altar. That event held religious power, communion with the cosmic order, but it also functioned as a calendar. It told them when to plant, when to harvest, when to hold the festivals. The structure became a stone clock. Its survival ensured the survival of the agricultural cycle it governed. This fusion meant the whole community had a stake in maintaining these monuments. Their stones weren't just shelter, they were pillars of identity, of law. Their link to the cosmos. With that partner chosen, the work of preparing the ground could begin. The blueprint was already there in the land itself, and the tools were there too, so they had the sacred site. The next task was to gather the bones of the earth, to shape them into a shelter that would last, and they didn't look far. That was the second principle, a radical acceptance of locality. They used only what was immediately at hand. That wasn't a limitation, it was their greatest strength. Think of a builder in a vast desert, nothing but sand and sun and clay. A modern mind might want to import granite from somewhere else. The ancient engineer saw a different possibility. They took that desert clay, mixed it with straw for strength, formed it into bricks. And they baked those bricks in the sun itself. That made adobe, a material perfectly suited to its home. It had high thermal mass. It absorbed the daytime heat, released it slowly during the cool nights. It regulated the temperature naturally, and for protection from rain, they developed plasters from local gypsum. A breathable, waterproof shield. The material was already in conversation with the climate. It had been there for eons, so by using it, the builder made sure the structure would expand and contract with the desert swings. As one system, not as a foreign stone fighting the environment. Now, a rugged mountain valley. Here, the local material is stone, lots of it. The builder became a master geologist. Learning to read the mountain's grain, they quarried enormous blocks from specific beds, where the stone naturally cleaved into usable shapes. Then, with painstaking skill, they dressed each block, shaping its faces so precisely that when placed against its neighbor, the fit was nearly seamless. They built without mortar. Stability came from the immense weight of the stone and the perfect friction-locked joints. This dry stone construction had a hidden brilliance. During an earthquake, the walls could shift and settle slightly, then lock back into place. A rigid, mortared wall might crack and collapse. This flexible assembly could dance with the tremors and remain standing. In dense forests, the material was timber. Ancient builders understood wood's natural flexibility. They selected tall, straight trees, crafted them into frames that could sway in high winds, absorbing the energy like a reed in a stream, rather than snapping like a rigid pole. This local approach did more than make construction practical. It minimized the environmental impact. No devastated landscapes from quarrying far away, no denuded hillsides from hauling logs across continents. The structure emerged from the site with a deep, inherent rightness. It looked like it belonged because it did. Every stone, every brick, every timber was a native of that place, but gathering the perfect material was only the beginning. The true magic happened in the shaping. How did they achieve such impossible precision with what we'd consider primitive tools? The tight fit of those stones wasn't just about looks. It was a response to the ground which could move. In places where earthquakes happened, builders learned a different way. They didn't build for stiffness. They built for flexibility. They built walls that could move. Think of the Inca work up in the Andes. They'd take huge, rough blocks of granite, then they'd shape them with stone tools. Not into simple shapes, into unique pieces like a puzzle. The edges were angled, cut on a slight bevel. When you fit them together, they locked. You couldn't get a knife blade in between. But there was no mortar. It was just gravity and friction and the way the shapes locked. When the ground shook, that's when it worked. The whole wall could sway. The stones would shift, grind against each other, taking the energy in all these small movements. Then, when the shaking stopped, they'd settle back. They'd lock into place again. The wall moved as one flexible thing. A rigid wall with mortar would crack. It would fail in one spot. This wall spread the force out. It stayed up. You see this idea in other places too. In ancient Greece, in Anatolia, sometimes they put wood in the stone walls, horizontal layers of timber. That wood acted like a ligament inside the stone. In a quake, the wood would flex. It would absorb the energy so the stone didn't shatter. It was a shock absorber long before the word existed. These builders understood you can't fight the Earth's power, you have to let it move. You design something that can yield just enough without falling apart. Designing for movement, not for stillness, that's an ancient idea engineers still study. But then, what if the threat isn't a sudden movement? What if it's something constant? Not a shaking Earth, but a burning sun. How do you build for that? A shelter that lasts, not under a sudden shock, but under an endless heat. The desert sun doesn't just shine. It bakes, it bleaches the land, it pushes life into hiding. To build there was to fight thermodynamics, and the ancient engineers won. They didn't use complex machines. They mastered the simple physics of heat and stone. Their secret was thermal mass. You know a dark river stone left in the sun. You pick it up in the evening and it's still warm. That's thermal mass. The stone absorbs heat slowly. It releases that heat just as slowly. Ancient builders took that principle and scaled it up. In ancient Persia, in Egypt, in the American Southwest, they built with massively thick walls. Adobe, mudbrick, stone, these weren't just walls, they were thermal batteries. During the scorching day, the sun beat down on those enormous walls. the dense material soaked up the heat. It could take hours, sometimes the whole day, for the heat to get inside. By the time the outside was blazing, the interior stayed cool, a refuge. Then night fell. The desert air turned cold, and the process reversed. The stored heat in the walls would radiate outward. It would gently warm the interior against the chill. The structure became its own climate regulator, absorbing and releasing energy in a slow rhythm with the sun. But they didn't stop at thick walls, they engineered the air itself. In Persia, they invented the windcatcher, the badger, a tall tower with openings facing the wind. It captured the breeze from high up, funneled it down a shaft. Often over an underground water source or through cool chambers below ground, the air would be chilled, moistened, then flow into the living quarters. It was a natural air conditioner powered by the wind. Even their city layouts helped. Narrow, winding streets created deep, shaded canyons. These corridors minimized sun. They could channel breezes, creating pockets of cooler air. This whole system was passive, no fuel, no moving parts, no external power. It was architecture in conversation with its environment. Using the desert's own cycles to create comfort, sustainability written in stone and earth. But a comfortable temperature is only one part. All this design meant nothing without the most precious resource. The true test of desert engineering wasn't just staying cool, it was finding water and keeping it. Water was the quiet force behind every desert civilization. Where rain was rare, survival meant controlling every drop. That was the fourth principle, a kind of hydraulic mastery, turning scarcity into abundance. These engineers didn't just find water, they directed its whole path through the land. Take the Nabataeans at Petra. In that red canyon, they dealt with flash floods and long dry spells. Their answer was a city-wide system. They cut channels into the cliffs to steer floodwaters away. They built dams to catch the sudden rush of seasonal rain. And then they stored it. They carved huge cisterns deep into the solid rock, hidden from the sun. From there, a network of ceramic pipes sealed with bitumen carried water under pressure. To fountains, to baths, to homes, they weren't just collecting rain, they were harvesting it with precision, turning something destructive into something that gave life. Then you scale that idea up. The Romans took hydraulic engineering to a monumental level. Their aqueducts are marvels of gravity-fed logic. They surveyed landscapes with incredible accuracy, finding the gentle, steady slope needed to move water for miles. They built bridges over valleys, tunnels through mountains, all to keep that perfect flowing gradient. This wasn't just about bringing water to a city. It was about bringing civilization itself. Public baths, fountains, sewers, all of it relied on that engineered, relentless flow. It held society together in a very literal sense. But maybe the most elegant blend of water and community came from India. The stepwell, the bayali, these weren't just wells, they were inverted temples. Architects dug deep into the earth, creating staircases that went down to the water. As you descended, the air got cooler, a refuge from the heat. The steps gave access as the water level changed with the seasons. But they also made a social space, a place for gathering, for ceremony, for quiet thought in the shade. The stepwell served the body and the spirit. Its very structure was a meditation on how precious water is. These systems did more than quench thirst. They held the ground together. By controlling runoff, they stopped the erosion that could undermine a city's foundations. Aqueducts and cisterns reduced pressure on local groundwater, preventing the soil from sinking, which can crack walls and topple towers. In managing water, they were managing the very earth they built on. That hydraulic genius was a direct response to environmental extremes. It was the art of making water's invisible force visible, making it tangible and obedient. But then there's a force that's never absent, one that acts silently every single moment, not the occasional earthquake, not the daily sun, the constant, patient, crushing embrace of gravity itself. How do you design for a weight that never rests? Gravity is the architect. It presses down on every stone, every brick from the moment it's placed. To build for eternity meant learning to speak its language. To use shapes that would turn that crushing force into strength. That was the geometry of stability, not a written formula, but a truth carved in stone. The most iconic answer is the pyramid. Its form is a lesson in pure compression. A broad, massive base to spread the weight of the stones above. Sloping sides that channel the force diagonally downward, inward, toward the solid earth. The structure becomes a mountain. It doesn't fight gravity. It invites gravity to hold it together. Every block pushes on the ones below, locking the entire mass into equilibrium. A shape so inherently stable it has endured for millennia, not in spite of the desert, but because its form is a direct response to the pull toward the planet's core. But the pyramid encloses a small space for its enormous footprint. To create vast, open interiors for temples, for markets, ancient engineers needed a different geometric miracle. They found it in the arch. The arch is a revolution in stone. A straight lintel spans an opening, and the weight above pushes straight down, creating immense stress at its center. It can crack, it can fail. An arch transforms that force. The wedge-shaped stones, the voussoirs, press against each other. The downward weight is converted into an outward thrust along the curve. This thrust is the arch's secret, a powerful force pushing sideways. To handle it, you need support. The Romans mastered this. They contained that outward thrust with massive piers, with thick walls, or with rows of arches pushing against each other, like in an aqueduct. This understanding allowed them to roof immense spaces, like the baths of Caracalla, with soaring vaults, arches extended into a ceiling. For the first time, architecture could create grand, column-free rooms. The arch didn't just hold up a roof. It invented a new kind of public space. Long before the true arch was formalized, other cultures found a different path. The corbelled arch, seen at the Lion Gate of Mycenae and in Maya temples. This technique uses a simple stacking method. Each course of stone is laid so it projects slightly inward over the one below. Gradually, layer by layer, the two sides reach toward each other until they meet at the top, capped by a single stone. It creates a stable, stepped span. It doesn't have the pure outward thrust of a true arch, but it achieves a similar goal. It redistributes weight down through the progressively supporting sides of the structure. A testament to patient, incremental engineering. Proof that the same geometric principle redirecting force along a path could be discovered independently across oceans and centuries. These shapes weren't the product of sudden genius. They were empirical triumphs, discovered through generations of trial, observation, and slow refinement. A builder would see a lintel crack. They would notice how a pile of stones settled into a stable slope. They would experiment with a curved opening and feel, in the structure itself, how the load seemed to flow differently. This knowledge was passed down through the weight of a stone, the line of a plumb bob, the instinct for what felt solid. But this mastery of form faced its greatest test not on solid bedrock, but on ground that could not be trusted. How do you apply the perfect geometry of the pyramid or the arch when the earth itself is soft, shifting, or saturated with water? The principles of stability had to meet the reality of an unstable foundation. The ground can be your biggest enemy. You can get the arch perfect, build the most stable pyramid shape, but if what you're building on is soft or wet or starts to shift, the whole thing just sinks. That was the real test, and it led to a fifth principle, this radical kind of ingenuity that started from the bottom. When the terrain itself was unstable, they didn't leave. They reinvented what ground could be. Think about building a city in a lagoon, not on an island, but right on the waterlogged mud. The Venetians faced that. Their answer was to drive thousands of wooden piles, alder, oak, larch, deep into the muddy seabed. They'd drive them so close together it was like a dense forest under the water. Then they'd cut the tops off level and build their stone platforms on top. The secret was the water. Submerged with no oxygen, the wood didn't rot. It slowly petrified, turned into a stone-like material. That submerged forest became a solid platform. An entire marble city could rise on it. They didn't fight the water. They used it to preserve their foundation. In the Mesoamerican floodplains, the Maya did something different. They built up. They made these huge artificial platforms, acropolises. They'd use vast amounts of fill, rubble, earth, limestone to raise the ground level, sometimes many meters, to create a high, dry foundation above the floods. On that man-made hill, they'd build their temples and palaces. It was a monumental act of landscape engineering, creating stable, elevated ground where nature only gave vulnerability. Sometimes the innovation was in the layers. In many places from the Middle East to Asia, builders would create a composite foundation. They'd dig down and lay a bed of large stones for drainage. On top of that, a layer of compacted clay as a moisture barrier. Then maybe a lattice of reed mats or timber beams for strength, followed by gravel, and finally the stone paving or brickwork for the floor. It was a foundational sandwich. Each layer had a job. The whole assembly could flex a little with ground movement, distribute weight evenly, channel water away. It prevented the sinking or heaving that cracks walls from below. These weren't just construction techniques. They were declarations, a statement that human ingenuity could create stability where none existed. By solving it from the ground up, they made sure everything else, the thermal walls, the hydraulic systems, the seismic flexibility, had a chance to last. The foundation was the silent hero, bearing the weight of centuries so the beauty above could touch the sky, and the sky that brought its own relentless challenges. After securing their creations against the earth, they then had to shield them from what fell from the heavens. A structure's biggest fight was usually with the sky. That was the sixth principal defensive design, architecture shaped by the air, by the water falling on it. It was a proactive idea. Form followed climate directly. The shape of a roof, the curve of a wall, those weren't about beauty first. They were about survival. Responses honed over generations of watching what weather does. In the high Himalayas with deep, heavy snow, the threat was weight. A flat roof would collapse, so builders made steeply pitched roofs. The angle was calculated. Steep enough that snow would slide off before it piled up dangerously. The whole structure, from foundation to peak, was engineered to shed that frozen load season after season. Then you go to a coastline hit by hurricanes. The enemy there was wind. A tall, boxy building acts like a sail. It catches the full force. Ancient builders in those places often went low. Structures nestled into the land when they could, and they softened the forms. Rounded walls, domed roofs. Curves don't give the wind a flat surface to push. They make the air flow around, deflecting the energy. It's the difference between a square block and a smooth stone in a stream. One gets battered, the other lets the current pass. Then there's the monsoon. In places like ancient Sri Lanka at Anuradhapura, the rain didn't just fall. It poured, relentless, drenching curtains. To handle that, buildings became water-shedding systems. Wide, overhanging eaves projected far out from the walls, like giant umbrellas, keeping driving rain off the foundations and the plaster. Floors were raised on stone platforms, lifting the living space above floodwater and damp. Elaborate channels were cut into stone courtyards along roof lines, creating a network to drain the deluge away. They even made special plasters, water-resistant, from local materials to protect the walls themselves. Every part worked together to manage water's path, from the moment it hit the roof until it was directed back to the earth. That form follows climate idea is everywhere. Narrow, shaded streets in desert cities fight the sun. Elevated stilt houses in floodplains fight water. Thick, windowless walls in the Arctic fight the cold. Each design is a direct conversation with a dominant environmental force. Its architecture as listening, a way of saying we see what this place throws at us and we shape our shelter to match. But here's the thing, that focus on physical survival, on outlasting storm and snow, it was never just about the structure. A temple that sheds monsoon rain is also protecting the rituals inside. A house that stands against a hurricane preserves the family, their stories inside it. The real purpose of defensive design was to make a sanctuary. A protected space where the intangible parts of human life, community, memory, ceremony could last. The stones were a shield for the spirit, and that spirit that need to gather and mark what matters that led to the final layer. The most human layer, the one that often kept a building standing long after its original builders were gone. Strong walls need a reason to stand, a purpose beyond just shelter. And that purpose was often built right into the act of building itself. The seventh principle was symbolic reinforcement. The rituals, the ceremonies, the sacred geometry. These weren't just decoration, they were the cultural mortar, the thing that held a community's commitment to a structure for generations. Think of a cornerstone ceremony. It wasn't just about the first stone, it was a public promise. The whole community would gather, leaders made offerings, priests gave blessings. They might place things inside the foundation stone, coins, scrolls, grains. These acts sealed a pact. They said this building isn't just stone, it's our shared future. It carries our hopes inside its walls. That psychological investment was profound. It gave people a sense of ownership, a sacred duty. A wall blessed by the gods was a wall people would fight to maintain. They would repair its cracks. They would defend it because it was part of their story. Then there were the alignments, a temple doorway positioned to catch the first ray of the winter solstice sun. That precise angle wasn't guessed. It was calculated through years of observation. The ceremony of watching that light hit the altar was a ritual. It connected people to the cosmos. But it also served a brutally practical purpose. That alignment was a calendar. It told them when seasons would change, when to plant, when to harvest. The ritual reinforced the structure's role as a timekeeper. Its survival ensured the survival of their agricultural cycle. The ceremony made the practical sacred, and the sacred practical. We see this in countless traditions. In many cultures, the ridgepole of a house was raised with a ceremony. It was seen as the spine of the home, the connector between earth and sky. Blessing it was believed to bring stability and safety. In others, thresholds were sanctified. The doorway, the vulnerable point of entry, was made sacred through ritual to protect those inside. These acts created a psychological fortress around the physical one. They gave people a sense of security, a belief that their home was watched over. This symbolic layer did something else too. It made the structure a living part of the community's identity. A cathedral wasn't just a place to pray. It was the heart of the town, its tallest landmark, a symbol of collective faith and effort that took a century to build. A Maya pyramid wasn't just a platform for priests. It was the axis of their world, a mountain that connected the underworld, the earth, and the heavens. When a building holds that much meaning, its care becomes a generational duty. Fathers taught sons how to repair its stonework. Mothers told daughters the stories of its founding. The building transcended its builders. It became an ancestor in its own right. Respected, maintained, preserved, that cultural commitment was often the final, decisive factor. The most perfect engineering could still fall to neglect. But a building woven into the soul of a people that had defenders, its cracks were filled, its roof was re-thatched, its story was retold. The ritual at the beginning ensured reverence for centuries after. The symbol outlasted the substance and in doing so, often saved the substance from ruin. So now we take every principle we've seen, the observation, the local materials, the seismic flexibility, the thermal mass, the water mastery, the foundational ingenuity, the defensive forms, and this deep symbolic purpose, and we put them to the ultimate test. We voyage to one of the most isolated and challenging environments on Earth, a place where the ice never melts, the wind never stops, and the sun disappears for months. How did ancient engineers not just survive but thrive at the very top of the world, the Himalayas, the air thin up there? Survival was an architectural problem. Builders in Tibet and Nepal faced four things: the cold, constant earthquakes, the lack of oxygen, and heavy, heavy snow. They built fortresses of ice and stone. Compact structures, multiple stories hugging the ground. Walls were thick stone, packed earth several feet thick in places, a thermal envelope. Inside, heat was treasure. You hoarded it. Windows were small, just slits. They let in light but kept the cold out. The whole form turned inward, protecting a core of warmth against the frozen outside. The monasteries, the Gompas, they're the best example. They didn't sit on the mountains, they became part of the mountain. Architects carved them into cliff faces. Used the living rock as a foundation. That was the genius. The cliff face acted as a windbreak, deflecting those Himalayan gusts, and it was a thermal mass. It stabilized the temperature against the swing from day to night. The mountain itself became the primary wall, the ultimate insulator. These structures seemed to grow from the stone. A marriage of human intention and geological reality. Even the roofs were part of the strategy. Up there, roofs were often built flat. It seems counterintuitive with all that snow. But it was deliberate. The flat surface was meant to hold the weight, to act as an insulating blanket of snow. The thick walls below were designed to support that frozen burden. Inside, life revolved around central hearths. The social heart was the thermal heart. People gathered around the fire for community, for survival, sharing radiant heat. Heat the stone walls would absorb and slowly release. Every choice was holistic. The form, the material, the orientation, all of it worked together to conserve energy, ensure structural integrity. In that environment, every calorie of heat, every ounce of stability was precious. Waste wasn't an option. These fortresses of ice and stone, they stand as a kind of monument. To a truth, in the most extreme places, architecture doesn't dominate the landscape. It listens, it adapts, it endures by becoming an extension of the land itself. From these peaks where the art was retaining warmth, we go to the opposite extreme, a landscape where the challenge wasn't conserving heat. It was escaping a sun that never relents. The landscape in Cappadocia, in Turkey, looks like a dream of stone. These towers and valleys, this surreal beauty, it was all sculpted by wind and water. But the real wonder there isn't on the surface, it's underneath. The ancient engineers there faced a dual challenge. The summers were blistering, the winters were freezing. And there was the constant threat of invasion from armies crossing the open plains. Their solution was to excavate. They didn't build a fortress up. They carved one down. They went deep underground into the soft volcanic rock. They carved entire cities. Derinkuyu is the most famous, a labyrinth. It descends over 200 feet. This wasn't a simple cave. It was a multi-level metropolis, meticulously planned. They removed material instead of adding it. The soft tuff was easy to carve with simple tools, but stable. It could support vast chambers, connecting tunnels. The temperature underground stayed constant, around 55 degrees year-round. That natural insulation was a refuge. From the searing heat, from the bitter cold, it was a perpetual, gentle spring deep within the earth. But a city needs to breathe. The genius is in the invisible infrastructure. Long, narrow ventilation shafts, drilled from the surface all the way down to the lowest levels. They acted as chimneys. Stale, warm air would rise out. And that would draw cool, fresh air in through other openings, a passive system. It ensured a continuous oxygen supply, even hundreds of feet down for thousands of people. They also engineered secure water sources. They tapped into underground aquifers with protected wells, so a siege above ground couldn't cut off their supply. For defense, they installed massive stone doors, circular, wheels of rock several feet thick. They could be rolled across key passageways to seal off entire sections, creating an impenetrable barrier against anyone who followed them down. This was architecture as sculpture in reverse. They revealed the shelter by taking the world away. Every room, every staircase, every air shaft was a negative space, defined by what was removed. It's a brilliant inversion of the typical construction process. When the surface became hostile, they found sanctuary, not by conquering the landscape, but by becoming one with its hidden depths. So there's Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital. It was built right on a lake, Lake Texcoco. The ground was basically marsh, soft, unstable, always wet. A modern engineer would look at that and think it's impossible. But the Aztecs, they didn't see an obstacle. They saw a canvas. Their solution was to build with the lake itself. They created these things called Chinampas. You might call them floating gardens, but that's too simple. They were artificial islands. They started by weaving big rectangular frames out of reeds from the shallows, staked those frames into the lake bed. Then they dredged up mud from the bottom of the lake, this rich, nutrient-dense mud. They piled it into the frames, layer after layer. Mixed in decaying vegetation, created a deep, fertile soil. But of course, a pile of mud in a lake would just wash away. So they did something else. They planted willow trees around the edges of each Chinampa. The willow roots grew deep and wide, knitting through the soil and the reed frame, binding the whole island together like a natural mesh. Those roots acted as a living, retaining wall, stabilizing the edges against the water. The result was this perfect, self-renewing farm plot. Water would seep in through the porous sides, keeping the soil moist. The decaying vegetation kept releasing nutrients. A single Chinampa could produce multiple harvests a year, and they didn't just build one, they built thousands, a whole grid of these fertile islands, a vast archipelago. Between them, they left canals, carefully measured canals. Those canals were the city's lifeblood. Canoes carried produce to the markets. They provided irrigation. And they acted as a buffer when heavy rains came or the lake rose. The canals could absorb the extra water, keep the Chinampas from flooding. The whole system was this dynamic, living architecture. Food production, water management, transport, it was all woven together into one resilient organism. The city didn't fight the water, it embraced it, drew sustenance from it, was shaped by it. Tenochtitlan became one of the largest, most vibrant cities in the world at the time, a metropolis born from what should have been a logistical nightmare. It was an engineering philosophy that saw the environment not as an obstacle, but as the building material. And from that, this adaptive, living city in harmony with water, you turn to a completely different ambition. Not adaptation, defiance, the pursuit of something permanent, eternal, in stone. A single stone could weigh more than a dozen elephants. Just moving it was the first challenge. Across forests, up hills, for Stonehenge or the Moai on Easter Island, the transport alone was a huge feat of engineering, without cranes, without engines. The methods are debated, but they all come down to simple physics and coordination. The blue stones at Stonehenge came from Wales, over 150 miles away. One theory uses sledges and lubricated tracks. You put the stone on a wooden sledge, you pull it along a prepared path. To reduce friction, you pour water on the runners. Or animal fat. That slippery surface turns an impossible drag into something manageable, still immense but possible. For bigger stones, like at Baalbek, they might have used rolling logs. You lever the stone onto a bed of wooden rollers. The team pulls from the front, and laborers at the back pick up the logs that come out. They rush them to the front. It creates a continuous track. It's slow. It requires perfect rhythm from hundreds of people. On Easter Island, the challenge was different. The moai were carved from volcanic rock inland. To move them to the coast, researchers showed a walking method. You rock the statue side to side with ropes. The massive figure walks forward, a controlled sway. It looks like a dance, a slow dance of stone and rope, but moving it was only half. Placing it with precision was the other. At Stonehenge, the giant Sarsen stones weren't just dropped. They were shaped with joints like a carpenter. The uprights had protruding tenons. They fit into holes in the lintel stones above. To do that, you have to raise the stone vertical, probably using earthen ramps and ropes and levers, then lower it carefully so the joints align, and the whole arrangement had meaning. The central axis of Stonehenge aligns with the summer solstice sunrise. So they didn't just haul and drop. They hauled, raised, and oriented it with celestial precision. The transport route, the final placement, it was guided by an understanding of the sky. That's the fusion, the brute force logistics of moving a 50-ton block, married to the delicate science of aligning it perfectly. It speaks to a society that was organized. Patient, deeply knowledgeable, they weren't just strong, they were smart. They planned for seasons, coordinated vast labor, executed a vision that spanned generations. The stone's journey from quarry to site was a ritual, a physical manifestation of their beliefs engineered into reality. But with all that effort, a question remained. Once it was placed so precisely, how did they make it stand for millennia against wind and weather and time? The real magic was in what held the stones together. The mortar, the plaster, it wasn't just glue. It was an engineered material made to last longer than the blocks themselves. Builders back then created binders with properties that feel almost miraculous. They didn't just resist decay, some of them actively fought it, healing themselves over time. The Romans mastered this, their concrete opus cementitium. Its secret was volcanic ash, pozzolana, mixed with lime and rubble. Add water, and it starts a chemical reaction that can go on for centuries. This concrete didn't just harden underwater. It thrived there. Salt water would fuel a slow process, forming new crystals to fill in microscopic gaps. The material got denser, stronger as it aged. That's why Roman harbors, after 2,000 years of waves, are often in better shape than modern concrete ports after a few decades. The material was alive chemically, constantly reinforcing itself, and this pursuit, it was global. In the Maya world, plaster was a sophisticated blend. They mixed burned lime with organic additives. Plant saps, gums, cactus juice. These compounds gave the plaster some flexibility, so when the ground shifted or temperatures changed, the plaster could absorb that movement. It could move with the structure. Then there are the recipes from ancient India. Historical texts describe complex mortars with unusual ingredients. Jaggery, which is an unrefined sugar, extracts from herbs and fruits, all added to the lime. Research suggests these organic compounds might have acted as slow-release agents, keeping the mortar from getting too brittle. They might have encouraged mineral growth to fill pores, creating a harder, more water-resistant finish. The goal was a binder that behaved like living tissue, resilient, adaptive, and then there's self-healing. In some ancient concretes, if a tiny crack forms, it exposes unreacted lime to moisture in the air. That can start a new, miniature crystallization process, sealing the crack from the inside out. It's a built-in repair system, engineered at the molecular level long before we had a name for it. This material science was a quiet revolution. It meant the joints, the most vulnerable points, could become the strongest assets. A wall wasn't just a collection of separate stones anymore. It became a monolithic, reactive entity. With that kind of durable skin and bones protecting their work, engineers then had to face a more volatile threat. One that could reduce even the strongest stone to rubble and ash: the relentless danger of fire. Fire was the nightmare for an ancient city. In a world built of wood and thatch, homes packed tight together, a single spark could wipe out generations in an hour. So building for permanence meant designing against that enemy, not just with stronger materials but with smarter planning. The strategy was layered. It started with the skin of the city itself. Builders turned to the earth for protection. They sheathed roofs in fired clay tiles or stone shingles, not thatch. Walls, especially the ones shared between buildings, were made from brick or stone. Ancient Rome had laws for that. These party walls would rise above the roof line. A stone barrier flames couldn't easily jump. It turned a city block from a tinderbox into a series of compartments, containing the disaster, but materials were just the first line. The layout of the city became a weapon. Wide streets, open plazas, they weren't just for processions or markets. They were deliberate fire breaks, gaps in the fabric too wide for embers to cross. If a blaze started, these spaces gave people room to flee. They created a boundary where the fire could starve. Then there was water, the ultimate antidote, woven into daily life for this reason. Public fountains, cisterns, wells, they weren't just amenities, they were emergency reservoirs placed strategically. In a crisis, every citizen knew where to find water. The communal effort, the bucket brigades, could mobilize instantly from these known points. This approach shows a shift in thinking. It wasn't about making one fireproof temple or palace anymore. It was about risk management for the whole community, protecting an entire urban ecosystem. The homes, the workshops, the markets. The survival of the whole depended on the resilience of all its interconnected parts. The city itself became the fire-resistant structure, engineered in stone but also in law, in layout, in shared civic knowledge. Yet even as they guarded against that sudden, raging destruction, there was another force always at work. A slower one, a patient, grinding adversary that could undermine the strongest foundation, topple the tallest wall without a single flame. The real opponent was the land itself. Given enough time, wind and water will wear down anything. So this principle wasn't about building something strong enough to take that. It was about convincing the landscape not to fight. You control erosion by joining with it completely. These builders didn't just put something on the ground. They changed the ground itself to protect what they built. You see it on steep hills, in the Philippines with the rice terraces or the Andes with potatoes. Those steps down the mountain aren't just for planting. They're massive works of earth. Each flat terrace works like a dam. It catches the rain running down, slows it, lets the water sink into the dirt instead of racing faster and faster, taking all the good soil with it in a flood. The wall of the terrace, usually stone fitted together, holds the earth. It turns a slope that was washing away into something solid and level. The farm or the village on that hill is safe because the whole hillside has been broken into these calm, patient steps. That same idea of working with the surface shows up in one of the big mysteries, the Nazca lines, those huge drawings on the Peruvian desert floor. People argue about why they're there, but how they've lasted is clear. The people who made them didn't add anything, they took it away. They peeled off the dark, sun-baked stones from the top to show the lighter, packed earth underneath. That clearing made the lines you can see, but it also did something more. The soil they exposed over hundreds of years formed a hard, protective layer. And the stones they took off, they piled along the sides. Those piles broke the wind. Somehow, this method fixed the lines against the things that should have wiped them out, the desert winds that scour, the sudden floods that come. They engineered the skin of the desert to last, and you saw this principle in ordinary places, everywhere. Retaining walls were the clearest example. Not just to make a flat place to build, but to stop a whole hillside from slowly sliding down and swallowing a city's foundations. They cut drainage channels with a plan. Not just to get rid of water, but to steer it somewhere safe, into a storage tank or onto a field, turning a problem into something useful, and they knew what roots could do. They'd plant trees and grasses on purpose, ones with deep, strong roots. That living web held the soil together, a natural net that kept the ground firm against wind and water. It was a complete way of seeing things. The building and the place were one system. By shaping the land carefully, cutting those steps into a hill, hardening a desert plain, putting trees in the ground, they took away the forces that would make their structures fall. They didn't defeat erosion, they made a kind of peace with it, and that deep, physical knowledge did suggest something else. It points to the way they thought, the ideas that let all these principles happen. The blueprint was a conversation, a master builder, his hands rough from stone, standing with an apprentice. He wouldn't just tell him how to cut a joint. He'd place the chisel, guide the hammer's swing, feel the stone's resistance give way. That's how knowledge lived, through touch, through repetition. Through a lifetime of shared silence on a scaffold, in a world without widespread writing, that was the only way. An apprenticeship was a total immersion. A young person would join a master's household for years, sometimes decades. They started by mixing mortar, hauling water. They learned by watching the angle of a plumb line, listening for the hollow sound that meant a foundation stone was set true. The knowledge was practical, immediate, earned. There were no shortcuts. A mistake with a load-bearing lintel taught a lesson no lecture ever could. But how do you remember the precise ratio for a stable arch? The ideal mix for a waterproof plaster that takes a lunar cycle to cure? You encode it. You turn numbers into narrative. Complex engineering principles were woven into stories, into songs, into myths told around a fire. A hero's journey might map the steps for surveying a canal. A song about the gods building the heavens could hold the sacred geometry for a temple's proportions. These weren't just entertainment, they were mnemonic devices, vibrant, emotional containers for technical data that needed to survive. By making the formulas part of the culture's heartbeat, they ensured the knowledge would be sung by the next generation and the next. This system created deep specialization, often guarded within families or guilds. A lineage of bridge builders on a major river would hold secrets about that specific current, that local stone. A guild of masons might possess a unique method for setting dome stones, passed only from father to chosen son. This protected quality. It ensured that the person building your city wall had learned from someone who had built 100 before. The wisdom was tried, tested, trusted. Yet this beautiful, intimate system had a fragility. Knowledge was a living chain, link by link. If a master died before passing on a key technique, if a guild was scattered by conflict, if a song was forgotten, that piece of the puzzle could vanish for centuries. It wasn't written down in a manual somewhere. It lived and died with the people who held it. That's part of the great mystery we face. We see the impossible structure, but the voice explaining exactly how to build it has fallen silent. We are left to reverse engineer the song from the stones. But what happened when different songs met? When a master from one tradition stood on a work site with a builder from a distant land? That chain of knowledge, it was never really cut off. Ideas in stone and mortar, they moved too, along the same routes as spices and silk. It was a slow current, this flow of engineering wisdom, connecting places through conquest, trade, just curiosity. The best solutions, they weren't invented once and kept secret. They were shared, adapted, perfected across continents. Take the arch. The basic idea shows up in ancient Mesopotamia. But the Etruscans started to refine it, and the Romans, they mastered it, made it the spine of their empire. That Roman knowledge flowed outward into Byzantine churches, Islamic mosques, the Gothic cathedrals of Europe. A single geometric idea passed hand to hand, changing with each culture that took it, or the windcatcher, the badger from Persia. This clever way to cool a building, it didn't stay in one place. You see it in Egypt, across the Gulf, all the way to North Africa. The same principle, catching high breezes to ventilate, it was exchanged, then adapted to local climates. A solution from the dry heat of Iran, finding a home in the courtyards of Cairo. We have records of this. Greek scholars like Herodotus wrote about Egyptian engineering. Later, Alexander conquering Persia, that opened a floodgate. Greek mathematicians and Persian builders sharing ideas. The Romans, they absorbed everything. They studied Greek and Egyptian techniques. They didn't just copy, they synthesized. They took the Greek post and lintel system and fused it with the arch. They combined Egyptian obelisk techniques with their own logistics to move even bigger stones. This blending created hybrids, often more resilient than the original parts. In Central Asia, along the Silk Road, fortress walls combined Chinese rammed earth with Persian baked brick. The result could withstand earthquakes and extreme heat and cold. In India, temple architects mixed stone corbelling from the north with load-bearing sculpture from the south, creating those tall, carved towers that seemed to defy their weight. That was the real power of connection. An engineer dealing with a flooding river might hear about a sluice gate design from a merchant who saw it somewhere far off. A master mason, taken as a prisoner of war, would bring his people's method for setting foundations. These ideas mingled with local traditions, producing something new, often better suited to the problem. The greatest ancient structures, they stand at the crossroads, literally, built with a fusion of intelligence from across the world. So if these methods were that sophisticated, that widely shared, that effective, it makes you wonder. In our world of steel and silicon, what have we forgotten? What can these old conversations with the earth still teach us? The legacy of those old conversations is still here. It's in the ruins, but it's also in the plans we're making now. Today, with the climate changing, architects and engineers are looking back at those old principles. They're finding that the most advanced sustainable design often has ancient roots. The modern green building movement uses thermal mass and passive ventilation as core strategies. Thick walls of rammed earth or concrete absorb heat during the day and release it at night. That's just like a desert fortress, and carefully placed windows and chimneys create a stack effect. They pull cool air through a building without any electricity. That echoes the windcatchers of Persia. This isn't nostalgia. It's high-performance design that's been proven over millennia. Our current struggles with water scarcity are leading us back to the elaborate cisterns of Petra, the stepwells of India. They're now models for contemporary rainwater harvesting. Cities facing drought are studying how these civilizations did it. They turned sporadic rainfall into a reliable resource. They created resilience through intelligent storage and distribution. Then there's the principle of using only local, low-energy materials. That's the heart of today's circular economy. Instead of shipping glass and steel across oceans, builders are rediscovering local stone, timber, and earth. These materials have a low embodied energy, and when a building's life ends, they can return to the earth. There's no toxic legacy. It's a return to the radical acceptance of locality, but scaled for a global need. Perhaps the most profound connection is biomimicry, the conscious imitation of nature's genius. Ancient engineers were master biomimics, though they didn't call it that. They observed how a termite mound maintains a constant temperature. It uses a complex system of vents and tunnels. They saw how a beehive's hexagonal structure achieved maximum strength with minimal material. These observations informed their own designs for passive cooling and structural efficiency. Today, we're relearning that language. Architects study termite mounds to design buildings that regulate their own climate. They analyze the geometry of spider webs to create lighter, stronger facades. That ancient practice of deep observation is becoming a cornerstone of cutting-edge science. It proves that nature has already solved many of the problems we're just beginning to face. These ancient approaches offer more than just technical tricks. They provide a holistic blueprint for creating infrastructure that's resilient, adaptable, and in harmony with its environment. In an era of climate uncertainty, their greatest lesson might be philosophical. To build for the long term, we must design with the land, not simply on it. We must see materials as partners. We must see forces like sun and wind as collaborators. The most sustainable path forward may be a return to a much older way of seeing, but this leads to a pivotal question for historians and engineers alike. With so much knowledge passed orally and lost to time, how can we be sure our interpretations are correct? How do we move from inspired theory to a verified understanding of how these ancient marvels truly work? The stones themselves are silent, but we can give them a voice now through science. It moves us past guesswork, past just looking. We have tools now that are almost like superpowers. One of the biggest is LiDAR, light detection and ranging. You fly a plane over a jungle in Guatemala or Cambodia, and it fires millions of laser pulses down. Most hit the canopy, but some get through. They hit the ground and come back. You filter out all the leaves, all the trees, and what you get is a perfect 3D map of the ground. And what shows up is entire cities, pyramids, water systems, all hidden under the forest. LiDAR finds new sites, yes, but more than that, it shows you the scale. How these places were connected. How they shaped whole landscapes, not just built a temple here or there. But when the secrets are under dirt, not trees, you use something else. Ground-penetrating radar. It sends radio waves into the earth. They hit things, a stone wall, a clay floor, an empty space, and they bounce back at different speeds. You get a sonogram of the soil, a ghost image of foundations, chambers, pathways. You can map it all without digging. You preserve the site while you plan exactly where to dig with minimal damage. Finding something is one thing, knowing what it's made of is another. That's where material science comes in. With tools like spectrometry, you take a speck of ancient mortar, tiny, and hit it with a laser. The light it gives off is a chemical fingerprint. It tells you the recipe, the lime, the ash, what they mixed in. Sometimes it tells you where the materials came from. That's how we know Roman concrete has volcanic ash from the Bay of Naples, or that a Maya plaster used pigments traded from hundreds of miles away. Then there's the ultimate test. Experimental archaeology. Researchers put on rough clothes. They use tools copied from finds, and they try to build. They try to move a giant stone block with just ropes and logs and people. To see what's actually possible, they mix plasters from old recipes and see how they weather. This work, it separates good ideas from fantasy. It tells you about labor, time, human ingenuity, in a way a scan or a lab test never can. So you take the data from the sky, from the ground, from the lab, from the field, and you weave it together. You get a picture, a complete one, and it's always being refined. Every new scan, every experiment adjusts it, turns speculation into supported theory. Gives us a clearer window into how these builders thought. And there's one structural puzzle more than any other where you'd want to use this whole toolkit. The Pantheon's dome, we can see its structure now. Scans show the whole thing. It's about balance. The foundation is a ring of travertine, that heavy stone packed with dense aggregate. That anchors everything. Then the walls curve up and the material changes. They used lighter and lighter stone, tufa, then brick, then at the very top near the oculus volcanic pumice. It's like a cake. The bottom is dense, the middle is lighter, the top is almost airy. That gradation was deliberate. It reduced the load on the lower walls while keeping the structure intact. And the shape itself, the dome, isn't uniform. It gets thinner as it rises, the base is thick, shouldering the weight, and it tapers toward the opening at the top. Those coffers, the indented panels inside, they aren't just decoration. Each one carved away non-essential weight, like the voids in a bird's bone. They removed mass where it wasn't needed, leaving a geometric lattice that actually strengthens the curve. But the real key is the concrete, Roman concrete, opus cementitium. Samples from the Pantheon show the perfect mix. Pozzolana, that volcanic ash, reacted with lime and water to create a binder that's more than cement. It's a living stone. Over centuries, moisture seeps through and fuels slow reactions. New crystals form, filling microscopic cracks. The material heals itself. The dome isn't fighting gravity. It's in a slow conversation with it, settling and strengthening as one form. This building brings every principle together. The observation of materials, the mastery of local ash, the intelligent distribution of weight, the shape that defends against its own load. It's ancient engineering made visible, a single idea executed perfectly. But for every pantheon, a monument to unified order, there's another kind of wonder, one that follows a different, almost organic logic. Not the logic of the circle and the arch, but the logic of the forest. The hive, the living network. A structure can be a question. In Sardinia, you have the Nuraghi. They're these towers, but they're not simple. They're complex, conical fortresses. Built entirely of dry stone, massive blocks fitted together without any mortar. Inside, they're labyrinths, narrow corridors spiral upward. They connect chambers, and these chambers have corbelled domes. The stones lean inward until they meet at a central point. The engineering is precise, it's self-supporting, and it's incredibly durable. But why build something so formidable? With such intricate internal spaces, theories range from defensive strongholds to communal granaries to the homes of chieftains. But many researchers now see another layer. Certain Nuraghi have doorways, internal passages, aligned with solstice sunrises or important stars. This suggests they were more than shelters. They may have been calendars in stone. Observatories, tying the community's rhythm to the cosmos, blending daily life with celestial order. The effort to build hundreds of these across the island. It speaks to a society organized around a shared vision, where architecture encoded both earthly security and heavenly knowledge. Then there are the moai, the giant stone faces of Easter Island. Their creation is an equation of almost impossible variables. Each statue, carved from volcanic tuff, could weigh more than 80 tons. They were quarried from the slopes of an extinct volcano, Nuraghi. Then, somehow, they were moved miles across rough, undulating terrain to ceremonial platforms along the coast. The how is a feat of social engineering as much as physical. The leading theory suggests a walking method. Teams used ropes to rock the statues side to side, inching them forward in a slow, coordinated sway. It would have required the labor of hundreds, working in perfect harmony for weeks or months for a single moai. This represents a staggering investment, a small island society's entire energy, for what? The traditional view sees them as monuments to ancestral chiefs. Symbols of political and spiritual authority, gazing inland over the clan lands. But newer interpretations consider the landscape itself. The placement along the coast, the orientation of the platforms. It may have created a spiritual map, a network of ancestral presence, defining territory, community, and connection to the land in a way that words could not. The moai were not just statues, they were active participants in the social and sacred geography. Their immense weight a testament to the weight of the beliefs they upheld. Both the Nuraghi and the moai defy a simple, modern categorization. They were not built purely for utility, nor solely for art. They exist in a space where engineering, community labor, political structure, and cosmology fused. A single act of creation, To understand them, we have to let go of our separated categories. For their builders, the practical strength of a dry stone wall and the spiritual strength of an ancestor's gaze were part of the same continuum. The structure's resilience in the physical world proved the potency of the idea it embodied. This deep integration points to a critical factor, an often invisible factor in ancient engineering success. One that goes beyond material or technique. It was the societal engine that made any of it possible. The foundation of an ancient wonder wasn't stone. It was people, a whole society of them. To build a pyramid or a wall across a continent, you needed an engine, a complex machine. It started with mobilization. A command from a pharaoh, an emperor that could call tens of thousands. But these weren't just laborers, they were farmers leaving their fields when they could. Artisans taken for their specific skills. Getting them to the site was one thing. Then you had to house them, feed them, give them water. At the peak of building a pyramid, the workforce was like a small city. All needing daily food, bread, beer, fish. That meant a supply chain across the whole kingdom. Granaries built near the site, bakeries working day and night. Fishing fleets on the Nile working at full capacity. The project created a temporary economy, all of it tracked by scribes. Every loaf, every jug. Coordination was everything. The work was specialized, teams of quarrymen cutting stone, haulers moving blocks on sledges, setters placing them with ramps, master carvers doing the final work. These groups had to work in sequence. A delay in the quarry meant haulers with nothing to do. A mistake in setting could stop everything. That kind of organization needs a hierarchy. Overseers, foremen, scribes, making sure the right materials and the right people were in the right place at the exact right time. What motivated it? The answer was usually a mix. In Egypt, it was divine duty and civic obligation. Building the pharaoh's tomb was a national project. It pleased the gods. It kept order. Workers were paid in food, beer, cloth. There was a sense of building something eternal. In other places, like with the Inca, labor was a tax. The mitre, every household owed work days to the state each year. That system built roads, terraces, temples. It tied the empire together with shared work. For the Great Wall of China, it was imperial authority, using conscripted soldiers and peasants, a defensive vision that took generations. The act of building created a social cohesion. Thousands of people from different villages working toward one visible goal. They shared the hardship, the rhythm of the work, a collective pride in seeing a wall rise, a tower take shape. It created a shared identity. They weren't just from a town anymore. They were builders of the wall, makers of the pyramid. That legacy wove into the culture. Told in stories and songs, the physical structure became a symbol of what their society could do together. So the engineering marvel is a human marvel. A testament to collaboration, organization, a shared will that could bend the landscape. It makes you think. We can analyze the mortar, map the stones. But how do you measure the weight of a common purpose? The silent agreement of thousands to lift something greater than themselves. And when the last stone was set and the workers went home, did they ever look back, knowing they made something meant to last millennia? What did that feel like, standing in the shadow of something that would outlive them? The silence in stonework, it isn't always deliberate. For every method we've managed to reconstruct, there are 100 more that are just gone, lost in the quiet between one generation and the next. Roman concrete, for instance, that self-healing material, the full recipe for it disappeared from common use for over 1,000 years. We've spent decades in labs trying to reverse engineer something their builders just knew. Or the Egyptian obelisks, a single needle of solid granite, hundreds of tons. How did they raise it? Engineers still debate it. Was it a giant ramp of sand they slowly dug away? A system of levers. That knowledge was so specialized, held so tightly, that when the last master died without an apprentice, it just evaporated. that loss, it's a shadow behind every achievement. It points to a real fragility. Human progress isn't a steady, accumulating line. It's more like a delicate thread spun across centuries, and it's vulnerable. It can be cut by a natural disaster that scatters a community, by a social collapse that ends all grand projects, sends the master builders back to farming just to survive, by an invasion that silences a whole culture, scatters its guilds. Sometimes it was simpler. A project just ended, the king died, the temple was finished. The workers went home, and that intricate, unwritten knowledge how to move a specific stone, how to mix a particular plaster, it faded from living memory within a lifetime. These gaps, they're a quiet caution. They remind us that our own towering things rest on a foundation of transmitted wisdom. Today, with digital archives and global databases, it's easy to think knowledge is permanent. But the ancient engineers show us something else. True understanding, the kind in the hands, the instinct for materials, the rhythm of a coordinated team, that's a living thing. It needs care, it needs teachers and students, it needs a society that values the slow, deep craft as much as the dazzling final result. And that leads to a final question. Maybe the most human one, beyond survival, beyond displaying power or honoring gods, what was the point of such immense effort? Why commit generations to a task you would never see finished? The final stone wasn't for the builder to see. It was a message, a declaration carved in rock but also in time. These structures were a civilization's voice. Shouting across centuries, we are here, we understood the world, we mastered its forces, and we mattered. This wasn't about a shelter that lasts 100 years. It was about creating a permanent anchor, a fixed point in the landscape, something that would endure long after the language was forgotten, after the gods were renamed, after the empire was dust. By conquering the desert's heat, the mountains' quake, the jungle's flood, they did something more than survive. They proved a symbolic mastery. Over chaos, a pyramid standing against the shifting sands was a statement of cosmic order. A fortress carved into a living cliff was a claim of permanence. They were turning human achievement into a geographical fact. Think of the pharaoh who ordered a pyramid. He knew he would never walk its finished corridors. His reward was the knowledge that his name, his reign, his connection to the sun god would be physically present on the horizon for eternity. The monument would become the landscape. Future generations would see that mountain of stone and know a great king once ruled. The structure was his identity made solid. The same impulse drove the Maya lords building towering temples, or the Chinese emperors connecting walls across peaks. It was a dialogue with the future, a desperate, beautiful attempt to say, remember us. This desire to leave a mark is universal. But ancient engineers gave it a physical form, so resilient it could argue with time itself. They built libraries, but instead of papyrus, they used geometry and gravity. Their texts were the alignments to the stars. Their poetry was the play of light through a precisely placed oculus on the solstice. To understand their buildings is to learn their language. A language of resilience, of observation, of deep reverence for the forces they harnessed. In the end, the goal was transcendence, to move beyond the fleeting human lifespan and touch something eternal. The stone would weather, but the idea, the proof of what they could conceive and execute would remain. When we stand before these places today, we are the future generation they were speaking to. We complete the circuit. Their enduring stones ask a silent question, not just how they built, but why. And in seeking that answer, we begin our own dialogue with eternity. Their legacy is a map of resilience drawn across every continent, from deserts to mountains, from under the earth to on the water. Ancient engineers showed a breathtaking synergy. Observation, innovation, respect for nature. These weren't separate tools, they were one unified craft. They'd look at a floodplain and see a foundation. They'd feel a desert wind and design a cooling system. They understood that true strength comes from dialogue, not defiance. The most enduring lesson they left is this: resilience is found in working with environmental forces, not against them. It's found in the radical use of local wisdom and materials, creating structures that belong to their place. And it's found in building not just for immediate function, but for community, for ceremony, for a legacy that would outlive its builders. The stones they placed are more than ruins. More than mysteries, they are active lessons, lessons in sustainability, written in geometry and earth, lessons in collaboration, showing what a society can achieve with a shared purpose. Lessons in long-term thinking, where a project's value was measured in centuries, not quarterly reports. As we face our own environmental extremes today, rising seas, intensifying storms, these timeless principles are not relics. They are a sourcebook, a profound inspiration for how to build a world that lasts. The conversation they started with the earth is one we must continue.